Section 20 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 5, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mary, Chapter 4, Part 3. The seat of English royalty had been transferred from the ancient palace of Westminster to Whitehall after a great fire in the royal apartments in the latter years of Henry VIII. Whitehall was a grand structure, now existing only in name. Its water gate, still bearing the name of Whitehall Stairs, marks its locality. St. James's Palace was chosen by Queen Mary as her private residence, but Whitehall was the scene of all grand state ceremonies and receptions, as St. James's is at present, the monarchs of England having been gradually burnt out of every palace, built on a scale suitable to their dignity. On the coronation morning, October 1st, the Queen and her train took their barges and landed at the private stairs of the old palace of Westminster, leading directly to the Parliament chamber, which was richly hung with tapestry. The Queen was conducted to the royal privy chamber, where she was robed, and rested there with her ladies till the hour of the procession. Blue cloth was laid from the marble chair in Westminster Hall to the pulpit in Westminster Abbey, and to the stage royal from the choir to the high altar, which was covered with cloth of gold. The choir of Westminster Abbey was hung with rich arras, and well strewn with rushes. A raised boarded pathway for the procession led to the royal stage, which was surmounted by a platform of 7 steps, covered with a striped cloth of gold, called baudekins, and on them the royal chair was set, covered with the same cloth of gold, the chair having pillars at the back, with a turreted canopy and 2 lions of gold. The procession began from Westminster Hall to the Abbey before 11 o'clock. The Queen's Royal Majesty, dressed in her crimson Parliament robes, walked under the usual canopy, borne by the barons of the Cinque Ports. She was supported by the Bishop of Durham on her right hand, and the Earl of Shrewsbury on the left. The ungraceful custom of the royal train being borne by a crowd of ladies is a modern innovation. The train of the first queen regnant was borne by the Duchess of Norfolk, attended by Sir John Gage, the vice-chamberlain. Directly after the queen walked the Princess Elisabeth, the Lady Anne of Cleves following her, as expressly declared by Noel. And here it deserves notice that the queen's sister, in every part of these important ceremonies, received all the honours, and took all precedence due to her rank. Moreover, it has been very seldom that either heir or heiress presumptive to the throne occupied a place in a coronation of such distinction. The Queen was met in Westminster Hall by Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, and 10 other bishops, with their mitres and crosses and copes of gold cloth, and the officers of the Queen's chapel singing. The bishops censed her and sprinkled holy water, and then fell into their places in the procession. That day, Gardiner performed all the offices of the coronation, usually pertaining to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was unhappily, as well as the Archbishop of York, in prison. It may be noted that the times have ever proved most disastrous for England when any convolutions of church or state had prevented an Archbishop of Canterbury from officiating at a coronation. Before 11 o'clock, the Queen was conducted by her 2 supporters to St. Edward's chair, prepared on the royal stage, and, having reposed for a while, was then led by them to the 4 sides of the stage, in the view of the whole assembly, where the Bishop of Winchester, standing by her side, declared to the people her free election in the following words, which were fuller and more comprehensive than any similar address. Sirs, here present is Mary, rightful and undoubted inheritrix, by the laws of God and man, to the crown and royal dignity of this realm of England, France and Ireland. And you will understand that this day is appointed, by all the peers of this land, for the consecration, unction, and coronation of the said most excellent Princess Mary. Will you serve at this time, and give your wills and assent to the same consecration, unction, and coronation? Whereunto the people answered all in one voice, Yea, 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 God save Queen Mary. The Queen was then conducted to a rich chair before the high altar and made her offerings. The cushion of velvet was put before the altar, on which she lay prostrate, while certain oraisons were said over her. The sermon followed, preached by the Bishop of Chichester, who was esteemed a most florid preacher, the subject being the obedience due to kings. Gardiner then declared the coronation oaths, and the queen, being led to the high altar, promised and swore upon the host to observe and keep them. Again the queen prostrated herself before the high altar and remained in this attitude, while the bishop, kneeling, sung the hymn of invocation to the Holy Ghost, commencing Veni Creator Spiritus, the choir and organ joining in the strain. After the litany, the queen was led to her traverse, on the left hand of the altar, and there was unarrayed and unclothed by her ladies of the privy chamber. This preparation seems to have consisted of the removal of her royal mantle, and she returned in a corset of purple velvet. After her unction by the Bishop of Winchester, Mrs. Waldegrave laced up the apertures left on the shoulders of the corset, where she was anointed, and put on her a pair of linen gloves. The queen then retired to her traverse, and returned in a robe of white taffeta, and a mantle of purple velvet, furred with ermine. She offered up the sword she was girt withal, by the Bishop of Winchester and Lord Arundel, who had borne it, redeemed it for a sum of money. The Duke of Norfolk, after she was seated in the chair near the altar, brought her 3 crowns. These were St. Edward's crown, the imperial crown of the realm of England, and a third, very rich crown, made purposely for her. These crowns were set, one after the other, on her head, by the Bishop of Winchester, and betwixt putting on every one, the trumpet sounded. During the singing of Te Deum, a ring was put on the queen's marrying finger by the bishop. Then the various great officers who had carried the remaining regalia brought them to her: the bracelets of gold, by the master of the jewel house; the sceptre, by the Earl of Arundel; St. Edward's staff, by the Earl of Bath; the spurs, by the Earl of Pembroke; the orb, by the Marquess of Winchester; and the regal of gold, by the Bishop of Winchester. And the queen sat apparelled in her royal robes of velvet, a mantle with a train, a surcoat with a kirtle furred with wombs of miniver pure, a riband of Venice gold, a mantle lace or cordon of silk and gold, with buttons and tassels of the same, having the imperial crown on her head, her sceptre in her right hand, and the orb in her left, and a pair of sabatons on her feet, covered with crimson cloth of gold, garnished with riband of Venice gold, delivered to her by her master of the great wardrobe. Thus royally invested, she was brought to St. Edward's chair, and when seated, the Bishop of Winchester kneeled down before her and made his homage for himself and all the bishops. I shall be faithful and true, and faith and truth bear to you, our sovereign lady and queen, and to your heirs, kings and queens of England, France, and Ireland. And I shall do and truly acknowledge the service of the lands which I claim to hold of you, as in the right of your church, as God shall help me and saints. And then kissed every one of the bishops the queen's left cheek. Then kneeling down, the greatest temporal prince, the Duke of Norfolk, and made his homage. I become your liege man of life and limb, and of all earthly worship and faith, and all truly shall bear unto you, to live and die with you against all manner of folk. God so help me and all hallows. Then he kissed the queen's left cheek. The premier noble of every class, the Marquess of Winchester for himself, the Earl of Arundel for the earls, the Viscount Hereford, and Lord Bergavany for the barons, repeated the same homage for their fellows, who, all kneeling, held up their hands meantime in manner of lamenting, or supplication, and the queen's highness held their hands thus between hers, while they by turns kissed her left cheek, and when they had ascended, for example, the steps of the throne, to that homage, they all with a loud voice together cried, God save Queen Mary. Her whole House of Lords then consisted of less than 50 individuals. The general pardon, published at this coronation, contained so many exceptions, that it seemed more like a general accusation, and bore melancholy evidence to the convulsive state of the times. Bishop Gardiner commenced the office of the Mass, and after the Gospel was read, he sent the book to the queen, who kissed it. She came down from the throne to make the regal offering, an obol of bread laid upon the paten or cover of St. Edward's chalice, a cruet of wine, and a pound of gold. The fact of the queen's receiving the Eucharist is not mentioned, but it is recorded that she bowed her head, and the bishop said a prayer over her, and her grace was conveyed again to her seat royal, where she sat till the Agnus Dei. Then the pax was brought her to kiss by a bishop. Afterwards, being conducted, the bishop of Winchester took the crown from her head and offered it. The other regalia were likewise offered on the altar, and received by the Dean of Westminster. The queen was then unclad of her robes, and other royal apparel given her by her great chamberlain. Her dress, when she returned from the abbey, was a robe of purple velvet, an open surcoat of the same, a mantle and train, furred with miniver and powdered ermine, a mantle lace of silk and gold, a riband of Venice gold, and a crown was set on her head. A rich canopy was borne over her by the barons of the Cinque Ports, and so she was conveyed in goodly order to Westminster Hall, with all her train, to dinner. The ceremony of the banquet was in all particulars the same as at the coronations of previous monarchs. To the grandson of the aged Duke of Norfolk was deputed the duty of Earl Marshal, but the duke made the usual entry into the hall, ushering the first course on horseback, accompanied by the Earl of Derby, High Steward of England. The queen recognized her sister in all respects as the next to herself in rank, for she sat at the royal table at her left hand. Anne of Cleves sat next to Elisabeth. Both had their especial service. These virgin princes, as Speed quaintly calls Mary and Elisabeth, were chaperoned by their father's surviving widow, whom they both treated with dutiful respect. The ambassadors of Cleves attended the coronation, notwithstanding the change of religion. They were part of that great mercantile alliance, in which the English and Flemish merchants were so closely knit. The champion of England was Sir Edward Dymoke, whose portrait, preserved in the College of Arms, in the act of throwing down his gauntlet, gives, indeed, the beau ideal of a knight, worthy to do battle, in vindication of the claims of his sovereign lady. He pronounced his challenge viva voce, right gallantly, the first in behalf of a queen regnant. If there be any manner of man, of whatever estate, degree, or condition soever he be, that will say and maintain that our sovereign lady, Queen Mary I., this day here present, is not the rightful and undoubted inheritrix to the imperial crown of this realm of England, and that of right she ought not to be crowned queen, I say he lieth like a false traitor, and that I am ready the same to maintain with him, while I have breath in my body, either now at this time, or any other whensoever it shall please the queen's highness to appoint, and therefore I cast him my gage. And then he cast his gauntlet from him, the which no man would take up. Yet if there ever was danger of a champion being called upon to prove his words, it was at the coronation of Mary I. The gauntlet having laid the usual time, a herald took it up, and presented it to Sir Edward, who made the same challenge in 3 several places in the hall. The queen drank to the champion, and sent him the gold cup. Then followed the proclamation of Garter King at Arms, which in this reign is by no means a dead formula, but vital with historical interest, since it proves that Mary challenged the right to be considered head of the church. As it is scarcely possible to doubt that she had just taken the ancient coronation oath, which bound the sovereign to maintain the church in all things, as Edward the Confessor did, this proclamation is difficult to reconcile with such obligation. That oath, by the want of moral consistency of the English legislature, was imposed on every one of her successors, whether their principles were Protestant or Catholic, until the alteration made by Parliament at the coronations of William III and Mary II. Surely it is but moral justice to show some mercy when discussing the characters of sovereigns whose oath and practice were required to be irreconcilably adverse. Garter King at Arms, having made 3 several obeisances before the queen's majesty, at the upper end of the hall, proclaimed the style and title in Latin, French, and English. Of the most high, puissant, and most excellent princess, Mary I, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, of the Church of England and Ireland, supreme head, largest, largest, largest. No observance, appertaining to an English sovereign, was omitted at this banquet. The feudal cups, the wafers and hypocras were all duly received by the maiden sovereign as by her ancestors. It was candlelight ere her majesty had dined, and after the tables were taken up and her hands laved, she arose and stood in the midst of the haute place, with the princess Elisabeth and Anne of Cleves, surrounded by all the nobility, according to their degrees. She then called the foreign ambassadors. After conversing with them graciously for a short time, and thanking them for their attendance, she gave them leave to retire. The queen changed her dress in the privy chamber, and all the nobility divested themselves of their robes and accompanied her, the princess Elisabeth and the ladies, to their barges, and whilst they made their short voyage to Whitehall stairs. Nor did the fatigues of the day end here, for the evening concluded with feasting and royal cheer at Whitehall Palace. Dramatic representations were among the entertainments at Mary's coronation festival. These were superintended by Heywood, the comic dramatist, whose attachment to the royal ritual had caused him to take refuge in France. By an odd coincidence, he returned to his native country on the same day that Bayle, the sarcastic poet of the Reformers, retreated to Geneva. If we may be permitted to judge by the tone of their writings, pure Christianity and moral truth lost little by the absence of either ribald railer, for they were nearer allied in spirit than their polemic hatred would allow. There is something irresistibly ridiculous in the change of places of these persons, resembling the egress and regress of the figures of a toy barometer on the sudden alterations of weather to which our island is subject. The comedian Heywood, it has been shown, had served Queen Mary from her childhood, beginning his theatrical career as manager to one of those dramatic companies of infant performers, which vexed the spirit of Shakespeare into much indignation, and caused him to compare them to little eyases. When Heywood, on his return from banishment, presented himself before his royal mistress, "What wind has blown you hither?" asked Queen Mary. "Two special ones," replied the comedian. "One of them, to see your majesty." "We thank you for that," said Mary. "But I pray, for what purpose was the other?" "That your majesty might see me." A first-rate repartee for a player and a dramatist, and her majesty named an early day for beholding him in his vocation. He was appointed manager of the performances of her theatrical servants, and she often sent for him to stand at the sideboard at supper and amuse her with his jests, in which, it is said, the Protestant Reformation was not spared, though, according to Camden, the arrows of wit glanced occasionally at his own church, even in these interviews with majesty. 4 days after her coronation, Queen Mary performed the important office of opening her first parliament. She rode to Westminster Abbey in scarlet velvet robes, her peers, spiritual and temporal, attending her, likewise dressed in scarlet, with trumpets sounding before them. In the Abbey, the Mass of the Holy Ghost was celebrated according to the ancient custom. It did not pass over without manifestations of the sincere Protestant principles of two of the bishops, Taylor of Lincoln and Harley of Hereford, who, refusing to kneel at the Mass, were thrust violently out of the Abbey and the Queen's presence. After Mass, the Queen, the Lords, and the remaining bishops adjourned to the usual Parliament chamber in Westminster Palace. They went in grand state, the Earl of Devonshire bearing the sword before the Queen, and the Earl of Westmoreland the cap of maintenance. After Mary had seated herself on the throne, Bishop Gardiner, as Lord Chancellor, made an oration, showing the causes "wherefore the virtuous and mighty Princess Mary, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith and head of the Church, had summoned her Parliament." He concluded by signifying her pleasure, "that the Commons should, at their accustomed place, choose a speaker." The Queen had, by previous proclamation, remitted to her people 2 heavy property taxes, one on lands and the other on goods, called, in the financial language of the day, 2/10 and 2/15, granted by the last Parliament of Edward VI, for the purpose of paying the debts of the Crown. The Queen in this proclamation acknowledged herself answerable for these debts, promised to use the utmost economy to pay them off from her own resources, although they had been chiefly incurred by the misrule of the Duke of Northumberland. She had no private purse of her own at her accession, and, as she had restored the estates of several of the great nobility, and had resolved not to touch any part of the church lands still retained by the crown, it must be owned that she commenced her government in a state of poverty, deep enough to exonerate her from any charge of bribing her senate. Some historians have affirmed that the emperor furnished the funds for bribing this parliament. If so, the recipient parties were strangely ungrateful, since the only measures, in which they opposed the queen's wishes, were relating to her marriage with his son, Prince Philip. The first act of legislation was to restore the English laws, regarding life and property, to the state in which they stood, in the 25th year of Edward III. Since the accession of the Tudor line, a hideous change had taken place. It is only common justice to Queen Mary to describe the state in which she found the laws at her accession. In the freer days of the Plantagenets, proof of an open or overt act of war against the sovereign was required before a man could be attainted. In the 3rd year of Henry VIII, a supposed knowledge of conspiracy was sufficient to incur all the penalties of treason. Very few of Henry VIII's numerous victims could have been put to death, according to the ancient laws. Towards the end of his life, English freedom was still more infamously infringed. Our Saxon chroniclers record that the Norman Conqueror and his sons made cruel laws for the protection of game. They acted as conquerors, without the sanction of the National Council. But Henry VIII found a parliament that could make it death for an Englishman to take a hawk's egg. In his 31st regnal year, the measure of his cruelty swelled higher, and conjuring, sorcery, witchcraft, were made capital. In his 33rd regnal year was the act compounded, to which Surrey fell the victim, under this mysterious title, prophesying upon arms, cognizances, names, and badges; likewise, casting of slanderous bills, that is, libel was punished with death. Conveying horses or mares into Scotland was capital. The act which punishes stealing in a dwelling to the amount of 40 shillings owes its origin to one of Henry VIII's statutes. It has been recently modified, as it had, since the decrease in the value of money, become even more cruel in the present era than in the 16th century. The state of vagabondage, into which the sudden withdrawal of the provision for the destitute, afforded by the monasteries, had thrown numbers of the lower classes, had been restrained with barbarous laws, in the reigns of Henry and his son, instead of a proper poor law. The iron sway of Henry VIII crushed not only the ancient nobility and the richly endowed monks, but also the common people. A statistic writer of those times, who is by no means properly impressed with the horror of the fact, computes that more than 72,000 persons were executed on the gibbet in his reign. It cannot excite surprise that the earliest specimens of parliamentary eloquence in the House of Commons was excited by the review of these atrocious laws, which by one consent they compared to those of Draco. As many men as there were in Parliament, so many bitter names and invectives were bestowed on those statutes. The Parliament next proceeded to annul all previous acts passed in the reign of Henry VIII, relating to the divorce of Catharine of Aragon and the illegitimation of her daughter. It has been already shown that, by power of that most unconstitutional act of Parliament, which placed the disposal of the crown at Henry VIII's will, he restored his daughters to their places in the succession. At the same time he left the acts of Parliament in force, which, by declaring his marriages with their mothers nullities, branded both sisters equally with illegitimacy. For his evil passions had caused such inextricable confusion in his family that it was impossible to do justice to Mary without injuring Elisabeth. It was indispensable for the public peace that the title of the reigning sovereign should be cleared from stigma. This could not be done without inexorable circumstances, tacitly casting a stain on the birth of her sister. Yet this was not the crime of Mary, but of her father. As far as the unfortunate case would permit, Elisabeth was guarded from reproach. for all mention of her name or that of her mother was carefully avoided, a forbearance deserving commendation when it is remembered that personal insult, as well as political injury, had been inflicted on Mary by Anne Boleyn. Such conduct, in a person less systematically calumniated than Queen Mary, would have been attributed by history to good motives, especially as she had just allowed Elisabeth, at the recent coronation, the place and honours of the second person in the realm. Whilst this parliament sat, a bill of attainder was passed on Lady Jane Grey, her husband, and Cranmer, who had been the same month brought to trial at Guildhall, before the Lord Chief Justice Morgan. Lady Jane pleaded guilty, and received sentence of death, to be burnt on Tower Hill, or beheaded at the Queen's pleasure. Such was the ancient law of England. If women either committed high treason against the sovereign, or petty treason by killing their husbands. Lady Jane Grey conducted herself with angelic meekness, and comforted her companions in misfortune. She was followed back to the Tower by crowds, weeping and bewailing her fate. It was, nevertheless, understood, by all about the court, that the Queen meant to pardon her, and she was soon after given every indulgence compatible with safekeeping. She was permitted to walk in the Queen's garden, at the Tower, and even on Tower Hill. But the most important act of the same session was that which repealed the laws passed in the reign of Edward VI. For the establishment of the Protestant Church of England, and made the anti-papal Church of Henry VIII's 6 Articles the dominant religion of the country, confirming Queen Mary in the office she so much deprecated as supreme head of that church. Its functions she continued to exercise till January 1555. That this was a period of grief and alarm to the Protestant Church of England, our ecclesiastical histories amply manifest, and to their voluminous pages the reader is referred, where may be traced the arguments of those illustrious Protestants, who undauntedly defended their principles, in the convocation held for the settlement of religion at Westminster in the autumn of 1553. Likewise details of the struggles, often personal and violent, between them and the members of the newly restored Church of Henry, for possession of places of worship. The Queen actually held the then despotic authority of supreme head of the Church more than a year and a half. During this period, had her disposition been as bloody and implacable as commonly supposed, she had ample time and opportunity to have doomed some of her religious opponents to the flames, or at least to have inflicted personal punishment on some of her numerous libellers. But it is as certain that till Mary surrendered her great power as head of the Church of Henry VIII, the cruelties of her reign did not commence. The only anecdote preserved by Fox, regarding her private conduct towards Protestant clergymen, it would be difficult to interpret into an act of malice. The arrest of Dr. Edwin Sandys has been mentioned. His offences against the Queen combined an attack on her title and insult to her worship. Nevertheless, she lent a favourable ear to the intercession of one of the ladies of her bedchamber for his pardon, in case the Bishop of Winchester had no objection. The next time Gardiner came to the privy chamber, the Queen said to him, "Winchester, what think you about Dr. Sandys? Is he not sufficiently punished?" "As it pleases your majesty," answered Gardiner, who had previously promised, "that if the Queen was disposed to mercy he would not oppose it." The Queen rejoined, "Then truly we would have set him at liberty." She signed immediately the warrant of his liberation, and called on Gardiner to do the same. This action, which redounds so much to her credit, it may be perceived, was only performed by permission of Gardiner. A curious instance of his power occurred about the same time. He thought proper to suppress the 2 folios containing the paraphrases of Erasmus, translated by Udal, Cox, and Queen Mary. This work had been published by the fathers of the Protestant Church of England, and placed in all churches, in company with the Bible, as the best exposition of the Gospels. Thus, one of Queen Mary's first acts, as head of the Church, was the destruction of her own learned labours. Surely her situation, in this instance, as author, queen, and supreme dictator of a church, by no means consonant with her principles as a Roman Catholic, was the most extraordinary in which a woman was ever placed. She did not, however, manifest any of the irritable egotism of an author, but, at the requisition of her lord chancellor, condemned her own work to the flames, in company with the translations of her Protestant fellow labourers, an ominous proof of Gardiner's influence, who swayed her in all things, excepting her marriage with Philip of Spain, to which he was, in common with the majority of her subjects, of whatever religion they might be, sedulously opposed. Among the other difficulties which Mary had to encounter in her reign, it was not the least that the rights of the queen regnant of England were matter of speculation and uncertainty. Her people believed that their country would be transferred as a marriage dowry to Prince Philip, and sink into a mere province, like Sicily, Naples, Aragon, and other adjuncts of the crown of Spain. The example of their queen's grandmother, the illustrious Isabel of Castile, had proved that a female regnant, though wedded to a sovereign, could sway an independent sceptre with great glory and national advantage. Yet this instance was not only distant, but solitary, for female reigns in the Middle Ages had been very calamitous, and the English people could not imagine a married woman otherwise than subject to her husband, politically as well as personally, especially if that husband were her equal in birth and rank. These ideas seem to have prompted Mary's hitherto compliant parliament to send up their speaker, with 20 of their number, to petition that the queen would not marry a stranger or a foreigner." Mary attributed this movement to Gardiner, and vowed she would prove a match for his cunning. Accordingly, she sent that night for the Spanish ambassador, and bade him follow her into her private oratory. There, in the presence of the consecrated host, she knelt before the altar, and, after repeating the hymn Veni Creator, she called God to witness, that while she lived she would never wed any other man than Philip of Spain, thus virtually making a vow to marry but one husband in case of her survivorship. This event occurred the last day of October, and for some days during the succeeding month she was extremely ill. On the 17th of November she sent for the House of Commons, when their speaker read the above-mentioned petition, and instead of the answer being given, as expected, by her chancellor, she herself replied, saying, that, for their loyal wishes and their desire that her issue might succeed her, she thanked them, but, inasmuch as they essayed to limit her in her choice of a husband, she thanked them not, for the marriages of her predecessors had been free, nor would she surrender a privilege that concerned her more than it did her commons. This interference of the House of Commons is generally supposed to have been the reason of their dissolution, which occurred on the 6th of December, when the queen came in state to the House, and at the same time gave her royal assent to 31 acts, not in the manner of modern times, when the clerk of the House names and holds up the act in the presence of the sovereign on the throne, who sits passively, till the officer, supposing silence gives consent, exclaims, La reine le veut. The queen or king wills it. The action of assent in the days of the first queen regnant was more graceful and significant, and throws a light on the ancient use of the sceptre. For the royal approval was implied by the queen extending her sceptre, and touching the act, immediately before the proclamation of La reine le veut. Traits exist of this elegant ceremonial from the time of Queen Mary down to the reign of Queen Anne. It is only mentioned in connection with female sovereigns, but it was, there is no doubt, the etiquette of all English monarchs, previous to the era of George I, whose want of English might have led to some inconvenient results, for the ceremony called sceptering the acts seems to have expired with the last queen of the line of Stuart. The queen had been informed that since her legitimacy had been confirmed by parliament, the French ambassador, Noailles, had sought to awake discontents in the mind of her sister Elisabeth, as if it were tantamount to her own degradation, and that Elisabeth was likewise jealous, because Margaret, Countess of Lennox, and Frances, Duchess of Suffolk, were sometimes given precedence before her at court. It is improbable that the queen should wish to give undue exaltation to the mother of Lady Jane Grey. It is, therefore, likely that the precedence was in some particular instance given them, as matrons, before a young unmarried woman. No pains were spared by the malignity of partisans to create enmity between the royal sisters, But for a time these endeavours were fruitless, since Elizabeth, when questioned by the queen, cleared herself satisfactorily of receiving nocturnal visits from the intriguing Noailles. Mary took leave of Elizabeth with kindness, on her departure from court, to her seat at Ashridge, and gave her, as tokens of her affection, 2 sets of large pearls, and several jewelled rosaries magnificently mounted. After the dissolution of parliament and the departure of her sister, the queen appears to have passed some weeks in a state of solitude, owing to the severe attack of her constitutional malady. Early in January, Count Egmont landed in Kent as ambassador from Spain to conclude the marriage treaty between Mary and Philip. The first symptoms of a political storm about to burst were then perceptible, for the men of Kent rose partially in revolt, and Egmont was in some danger of being torn to pieces by the common people for the queen's bridegroom. However, he arrived safely at Westminster, and in a set speech opened his mission to the queen. Her reply had some spice of prudery in its composition. She said, "It became not a female to speak in public on so delicate a subject as her own marriage. The ambassador might confer with her ministers, who would utter her intentions. But," she continued, casting down her eyes on her coronation ring, which she always wore on her finger, "they must remember her realm was her first husband, and no consideration should make her violate the faith she pledged to her people at her inauguration." On the 14th of January, the articles of the queen's marriage were communicated to the Lord Mayor and the City of London. According to this document, Mary and Philip were to bestow on each other the titular dignities of their several kingdoms. The dominions of each were to be governed separately, according to their ancient laws and privileges. None but natives of England were to hold offices in the queen's court and government, or even in the service of her husband. If the queen had a child, it was to succeed to her dominions, with the addition of the whole inheritance Philip derived from the dukes of Burgundy, namely Holland and the rich Flemish provinces, which in that case were forever to be united to England, a cause which, it is said, excited the greatest indignation in the mind of Don Carlos, the young heir of Philip. The queen was not to be carried out of her dominions without her especial request, nor her children without the consent of the nobility. Philip was not to engage England in his father's French wars. He was not to appropriate any of the revenue, ships, ammunition, or crown jewels of England. If the queen died without children, all connection between England and her husband was instantly to cease. If Philip died first, Queen Mary was to enjoy a dower of 60,000 ducats per annum, secured on lands in Spain and the Netherlands. No mention is made of any portion, or dote, brought by Mary to her spouse. One noxious article atoned to the ambitious Spaniard for the rigour of these parchment fetters, and this stipulated that Philip should aid Mary in governing her kingdoms, a fact that deserves particular notice. The week after these articles became public, 3 insurrections broke out in different parts of England. One was organized in the Middle Counties by the vassals of the Duke of Suffolk for the restoration of Lady Jane Grey. Another by Sir Peter Carew in the west of England, with the intention of placing the Earl of Devonshire and the Princess Elisabeth on the throne. As Sir Peter Carew was desirous of establishing the Protestant religion, with a strong bias of Calvinism, it is surprising he was not likewise an upholder of Lady Jane Grey's title. The third and most formidable of these revolts occurred in Kent, headed by Sir Thomas Wyatt, a youth of 23. He was a Catholic, but having accompanied his father, the illustrious poet and friend of Anne Boleyn, on an embassy to Spain, where the elder Sir Thomas Wyatt was in danger from the Inquisition, he conceived in his boyhood such a detestation of the Spanish government, civil and religious, that his ostensible motive of revolt was to prevent like tyranny being established in England by the wedlock of the queen with Philip of Spain. Yet it is scarcely possible to imagine anything worse in Spain than had already taken place in England under Henry VIII, such as the tortures and burning of Anne Askew, Friar Forrest, and numerous other Protestants and Roman Catholics. As Wyatt was at the same time a Catholic and a partisan of the Princess Elizabeth, his conduct is exceedingly mysterious. unless, indeed, he was an anti-papal Catholic, and, discontented at the prospect of Mary's resignation of church supremacy, was desirous of placing Elizabeth, who professed the same religion, in her sister's place in church and state. The queen was so completely deceived by the affected approbation of the Duke of Suffolk to her marriage, that she actually meant to employ him against Wyatt, and, sending for him to Sion, found he had decamped with his brothers, Lord Thomas and Lord John Grey, and a strong party of horse they had raised. They took their way to Leicestershire, proclaiming Lady Jane Grey queen in every town through which they passed, to the infinite injury of that hapless young lady still a prisoner in the Tower. The Grey revolt was quickly suppressed by the queen's kinsman, the Earl of Huntingdon, in a skirmish near Coventry, when the duke and his brothers became fugitives, absconding for their lives. Carew's insurrection was likewise abortive, and he fled to France. This good news was brought to the queen on the 1st day of February, at the very moment when most alarming intelligence was communicated to her regarding Wyatt's progress in Kent. The queen had sent the aged Duke of Norfolk, who had ever proved a most successful general, with her guards and some artillery, accompanied by 500 of the London trained bands, commanded by Captain Brett. This person was secretly a partisan of Wyatt, and actually revolted to him at Rochester with his company. Brett's defection caused the loss of the queen's artillery, and the utter dispersion of her forces, and gave such encouragement to the rebels, that Wyatt advanced to Deptford, at the head of 15,000 men, from whence he dictated, as his only terms of pacification, that the queen and her council were to be surrendered to his custody. The queen, with her wonted spirit, preferred to abide the results of open war, and prepared with intrepidity to repel the besiegers of her metropolis. Section 20.